Inside the walls of the British royal institution, where every smile is calculated and every silence carries meaning, a silent but intense battle of perception has been unfolding for years. Not a war with weapons, not a war with open declarations, but a far more dangerous kind of conflict, the war of legacy, memory, and historical positioning. At the center of this unfolding narrative stands a figure often described as one of the most disciplined and unshakably controlled members of the royal family, Princess Anne. Known for her strict adherence to duty, precision in protocol, and decades of relentless public service, and represents continuity, tradition, and institutional memory. On the opposite side of this evolving perception stands Queen Camilla, a figure whose public role has long been shaped by controversy, transition, and the difficult weight of stepping into a space historically defined by Queen Elizabeth II's overwhelming legacy. What makes this situation more complex is not open conflict, but the silent tension that comes from roles being redefined in real time. After the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, an era ended that had shaped not just the monarchy but the emotional identity of the British public for decades. Elizabeth was not just a monarch, she was a symbol of stability. And when such a symbol disappears, the vacuum it leaves behind is not easily filled. In that vacuum, every gesture, every title, every charitable association becomes more than formality, it becomes interpretation. And interpretation, inside the royal framework, is power. Princess Anne, throughout her life, has never been a figure of spectacle. She does not operate through headlines or emotional displays. Instead, her influence is rooted in consistency and institutional authority. Over decades, she has built a reputation for being one of the hardest-working royals, often attending more engagements than any other senior family member. But beyond the numbers lies something deeper, a strict personal alignment with what she believes the monarchy should represent. Duty over image. Service over narrative. Structure over sentiment. This mindset becomes crucial when analyzing her position in the post-Elizabeth era, where symbolism has become just as important as authority. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla's position is structurally legitimate but emotionally complicated in the eyes of the public narrative. Her transition into the role of queen consort, and later queen, exists within a sensitive historical context that still carries echoes of the past. This makes every public appearance, every title reference, and every institutional association part of a larger perception struggle, not necessarily of direct confrontation, but of legacy alignment. Who represents continuity? Who carries emotional inheritance? Who defines the next chapter of monarchy in the public mind? Within this layered environment, even the smallest gestures begin to take on amplified meaning. A title spoken in a formal setting, a protocol choice at an official event, or even a symbolic absence of acknowledgement can be interpreted as part of a much larger narrative structure. This is where Princess Anne's reputation for precision becomes central. She is not someone who speaks loosely or acts impulsively in public settings. Every action attributed to her influence is filtered through decades of disciplined royal behavior. That is what makes any perceived moment of tension around her feel significant, even when the monarchy itself operates under strict codes that discourage public conflict. At the same time, the legacy of Queen Elizabeth continues to cast a long institutional shadow. Her reign was not just long, it was defining. Charitable institutions, public organizations, and national identity markers were all shaped under her patronage. In the aftermath of her passing, the question naturally arises: who carries forward that emotional and institutional inheritance? In systems built on tradition, inheritance is not just legal, it is symbolic. And symbolism, in this environment, often becomes more powerful than formal authority itself. It is within this fragile balance of legacy, perception, and institutional identity that narratives of tension begin to form. Not always based on direct events, but on interpretation of roles, alignment of influence, and the evolving meaning of monarchy in a post-Elizabeth world. And as these narratives develop, certain figures inevitably become central to how the story is told, understood, and repeated in public imagination. As the post-Elizabeth era settled into a new normal, the royal environment began to shift in subtle but highly visible ways. Public events, which once carried the overwhelming presence of Queen Elizabeth II, now felt structurally different. The same halls, the same traditions, the same ceremonies continued, but the emotional center of gravity had changed. In that shift, every senior royal figure was no longer just performing duty, they were now also unconsciously performing interpretation of the past. And interpretation, in a monarchy built on symbolism, can sometimes be more influential than authority itself. Within this environment, Princess Anne's presence at major royal occasions has often been viewed through a particular lens: discipline, continuity, and strict adherence to protocol. At formal gatherings, she does not position herself as emotional or reactive. Instead, she functions as a stabilizing force within the structure of royal tradition. This consistency has led many observers to view her as one of the most institutionally pure representatives of the monarchy's working core. However, in a system where perception shapes narrative, even silence can be read as a statement, and even neutrality can be interpreted as alignment. Queen Camilla's role, on the other hand, exists within a far more complex symbolic framework. Her position as queen is formally established within constitutional structure, yet her public identity has always carried the weight of historical comparison and generational memory. In the absence of Queen Elizabeth II, that comparison becomes even more pronounced. Every appearance is not just evaluated in isolation, but measured against a decades-long emotional benchmark that defined what the monarchy represented to millions of people. This creates a unique dynamic where legitimacy and legacy operate on two different emotional frequencies, one institutional, one cultural. At high-profile royal events, especially those involving senior family members, interactions are often observed with intense public scrutiny. Gestures that would normally be considered routine, greetings, acknowledgements, seating arrangements, or protocol sequences, become part of a larger interpretive framework. In this framework, Princess Anne's strictly professional demeanor is often contrasted with the evolving public role of Queen Camilla. Not necessarily as direct opposition, but as two different expressions of monarchy operating within the same ceremonial space. One of the key themes that emerges in this narrative environment is the question of continuity versus transition. Continuity is embodied in long-standing service, institutional memory, and decades of consistent public duty. Transition is embodied in adaptation, repositioning, and the redefinition of public roles following the end of a historic reign. These two forces do not openly clash, but they coexist in tension, especially when legacy is involved. And in the absence of Queen Elizabeth II, legacy itself becomes an active force rather than a historical memory. It is within this atmosphere that certain public moments are interpreted with heightened significance. A formal dinner, for example, is not just a ceremonial gathering. It becomes a stage where hierarchy, respect, and institutional messaging are all silently negotiated. Who acknowledges whom, how titles are referenced, and how individuals position themselves within the room all contribute to a larger perceived narrative. These perceptions are then amplified by public discourse, media interpretation, and retrospective storytelling. Princess Anne's reputation for precision in such environments plays a crucial role in how these moments are understood. She is widely regarded as someone who understands the boundaries of royal protocol better than most, having spent decades navigating its strictest expectations. This makes any perceived deviation, hesitation, or symbolic gesture attributed to her influence appear highly meaningful within narrative discussions. However, it is important to understand that in such environments, meaning is often constructed after the fact, shaped as much by interpretation as by observable action. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla's public position continues to evolve through official duties, ceremonial appearances, and institutional representation. Over time, her role has increasingly been integrated into the formal structure of monarchy, yet the emotional framing surrounding her remains layered with historical context. This creates a dual narrative, one of official legitimacy, and one of ongoing public interpretation. And it is within this dual narrative that most of the perceived tension is constructed, not necessarily as direct conflict, but as overlapping symbolism. As these narratives develop, the monarchy becomes less about individual moments and more about cumulative perception. Every appearance adds another layer. Every event adds another reference point. And over time, these layers form a broader public story that extends beyond any single interaction. In this story, figures like Princess Anne and Queen Camilla are not just individuals. They become symbols within a larger framework of continuity, transition, and legacy redefinition. And as this framework continues to evolve, the question is no longer about isolated moments, but about how history will ultimately interpret this entire transitional era inside the royal institution. As the narrative of transition deepened within the royal institution, attention gradually shifted from isolated ceremonial moments to something far more structurally significant: the control and continuation of legacy through institutional influence. In the monarchy, legacy is not only preserved through titles or public appearances, but also through long-term patronage of charities, foundations, and cultural institutions that carry emotional weight for the public. These organizations become living extensions of royal identity, and whoever is associated with them is automatically woven into the broader perception of continuity and heritage. Following the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, many of these institutions entered a new phase of symbolic transition. Organizations that had once been inseparable from Elizabeth's identity, through decades of patronage, visits, and public association, now faced a question of continuity. In such environments, even routine changes in patron roles or ceremonial involvement can be interpreted as shifts in legacy ownership. This is not a matter of legal transfer, but of emotional inheritance in the public imagination. And emotional inheritance is often far more powerful than formal authority. Within this evolving structure, Princess Anne's long-standing involvement in charitable work becomes particularly significant. Over decades of public service, she has developed one of the most extensive and consistent records of patronage within the royal family. Her approach has always been pragmatic rather than symbolic, focused on operational continuity rather than image building. She has supported organizations across healthcare, youth development, education, and rural services, maintaining long-term commitments rather than short-term visibility. This creates a perception of stability around her role, where institutions associated with her are seen as structurally secure rather than temporarily highlighted. At the same time, the broader royal ecosystem continues to adjust to the redistribution of responsibilities following the change of reign. As roles shift, so does the visibility of different family members within key institutions. This creates a complex environment where charities and organizations become part of a larger symbolic map. Each patronage is not just an administrative assignment, but a signal of presence, influence, and continuity within the monarchy's evolving structure. In this context, the idea of legacy alignment becomes more important than ever before. Another important layer in this narrative is the emergence of the next generation of royal representation, particularly Catherine, Princess of Wales. Her position within the monarchy has increasingly been associated with continuity, modern public engagement, and long-term institutional relevance. Through her public work in early childhood development, mental health awareness, and healthcare initiatives, she has built a distinct identity that resonates strongly with the public's expectation of a future-oriented monarchy. Unlike purely ceremonial roles, her involvement in structured social initiatives creates a perception of active, hands-on engagement with national issues. This positioning naturally places Catherine within the broader conversation about future legacy carriers. As older institutions transition from the Elizabeth era into a new phase, attention increasingly shifts toward who will define the monarchy's next long-term identity. In such discussions, Catherine's role is often framed not just as supportive, but as foundational to the future structure of royal public engagement. This is not based on sudden change, but on a gradual accumulation of visible, consistent, and structured public work. Within this layered environment, Princess Anne's long-standing institutional presence and Catherine's rising public role begin to form an indirect continuity line in public perception. One represents decades of uninterrupted service and structural discipline. The other represents the emerging face of a modernized but still tradition-rooted monarchy. Together, they create a sense of generational bridge-building within the institution, where legacy is not simply inherited but continuously reinforced through visible commitment. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla's role remains firmly within the formal structure of monarchy, yet her position continues to be interpreted through the broader emotional framework of historical comparison. In a system where symbolism carries as much weight as structure, every association with legacy institutions becomes part of a larger interpretive narrative. This is not about direct opposition, but about how different royal roles are perceived in relation to the long shadow of Queen Elizabeth II's influence. As a result, the monarchy today operates in a multi-layered symbolic environment where three forces coexist: institutional continuity, transitional adjustment, and future-oriented redefinition. Each figure within the royal family contributes to one or more of these forces, whether through decades of service, current role adaptation, or emerging public identity. And it is the interaction between these forces, not individual events, that shapes the broader perception of power, influence, and legacy within the royal institution. As the modern monarchy continues to evolve beyond the defining era of Queen Elizabeth II, the final question is no longer about individual personalities, but about long-term legacy architecture, who carries it forward, how it is preserved, and where public perception ultimately anchors itself. In any institution built on centuries of tradition, transitions of this scale are never immediate. They unfold gradually, through ceremony, repetition, public service, and the steady accumulation of symbolic meaning. Over time, these layers form a structure that outlives any single moment, speech, or headline. Within this structure, Queen Camilla's position remains formally secure as part of the reigning framework of the monarchy. Her role is embedded within constitutional tradition, and her responsibilities are tied directly to the current reign. However, in the world of public perception, formal position and emotional legacy are not always identical. The legacy of Queen Elizabeth II remains a defining reference point for how the monarchy is emotionally understood by the public, and any figure operating in the present inevitably exists in relation to that historical standard. This creates a unique dynamic where present authority and historical memory coexist but do not necessarily merge. Princess Anne, throughout this evolving era, is often viewed through the lens of institutional continuity. Her decades of service represent an unbroken thread through multiple reigns, political shifts, and cultural transformations. She is not positioned as a symbolic replacement or challenger, but rather as a stabilizing force whose identity is deeply tied to duty and consistency. In transitional periods like this, such figures become reference points, anchors that define what has remained constant while everything else adjusts around them. At the same time, Catherine, Princess of Wales, has increasingly emerged as the most visible representation of the monarchy's future-facing identity. Her public work, structured initiatives, and consistent engagement with social causes have positioned her as a central figure in the long-term evolution of royal public service. In contrast to purely ceremonial symbolism, her role is defined by active involvement in issues that directly connect the monarchy to contemporary societal concerns. This creates a perception of continuity with adaptation, tradition carried forward in a modern form. As these roles continue to develop, the monarchy becomes less about static hierarchy and more about layered responsibility. Each senior figure contributes differently, one through constitutional authority, one through long-standing institutional service, and one through emerging public-facing engagement that reflects the direction of the future. These layers do not cancel each other out. Instead, they form a complex structure of overlapping influence that defines how the institution is perceived in the present era. In this environment, legacy is not a single possession to be claimed or transferred. It is a continuous process of reinforcement through action, visibility, and public trust. Institutions associated with Queen Elizabeth II's era continue to carry emotional weight, but over time, that weight is redistributed through ongoing patronage, evolving leadership, and generational transition. This is not a sudden shift, but a gradual recalibration of meaning inside a centuries-old system. Ultimately, the modern royal narrative is shaped not by isolated moments of tension or alignment, but by long-term perception cycles. What the public remembers is not only what is said or done, but what is consistently reinforced through years of service and visibility. In that sense, the monarchy is always in motion, always rewriting itself through the actions of those who represent it. And as this new era continues to unfold, the defining question is no longer about who stands closest to the past, but who most effectively carries the institution forward into the future while preserving its continuity.